Well, hello there. Welcome to the Pacific War channel, the channel where we cover everything up to the Pacific War, 1937 to 1945. And this is going to be my first attempt at a book review. So this is seriously a work in progress, so please bear with me. I'm hoping to do at least one book review every 2 weeks and or Pacific War film reviews. Give me a second as my parrot is begging for a peanut. And honestly, your critique will help in building this up, so this is going to be the first time I do this. Now, since my first few episodes are going to be on the Opium Wars during the 19th century, this is going to be a book review on the Opium Wars, the addiction of one empire, and the corruption of another, by W. Travis Haynes III and Frank Sanello. It is available in hard copy at any retailer, on Kindle. Unfortunately, it is not on Audible, as I know a lot of people these days are using those. Me myself, I love it in traffic. It makes, uses your time efficiently. So here's a little bit about the authors. Frank Sanello is an author and a journalist who writes about cultural anthropology, politics, and history. He graduated from the University of Chicago with a BA in English Literature and from the University of California with an MFA in screenwriting. He has written for countless news outlets such as the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Tribune, prior to authoring books. There's a lot more, I just didn't want to make the list any more bearing. W. Travis Haynes III is a professor of history who is taught at Santa Monica College, California State University, UCLA, and the College of the Desert. He received his BA specializing in Middle East and Africa in history from the University of North Carolina, and his MA and PhD specializing in modern Europe, British Empire, Middle East, Africa, and South Asian history from the University of Texas. So, a brief summary of the book. Travis Haynes and Frank Sanello teamed up to produce this book, which was published in 2002. The book is on the events of the two Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860. It explains the economic, political, and historical causes for the two conflicts, which occurred, and what this actually caused in the greater significant, what made it significant for greater history as a whole. The book also covers other significant events during the 19th century, such as the Taiping Rebellion, but into less detail. Obviously, it's on the Opium Wars specifically, although they do overlap. That's why it's actually spoken about. The book is told from a British and Chinese perspective, but sometimes it does dwell into the lesser actors, such as the United States of America and France, particularly at the Second Opium War. The book might be written by two Westerners, but they do make a great effort to be unbiased. It's a hit or a miss. Any book, honestly, written by Westerners about Asian history, you're going to run into biases anyways, but I can give these guys kind of like a 4 to 5 stars. They did a good job trying to do this. The book explicitly speaks about the opioid crisis in China and the effects it had on the population, as well as comparing it to today's drug cartels seen in Latin America, for example. So, to review this book more in depth, there's a large emphasis on primary sources. Each chapter utilizes many eyewitness accounts to the events, which really gives life to the events. You get a real sense of what occurred during the actual battles, diplomacy, and meetings between high officials. There is a particular problem with this, however. Many of the primary sources are from British officers and or representatives to the Crown, who, of course, tend to exaggerate or lie about events, and it doesn't take a historic scholar to see this. This is very apparent when primary sources are explaining the outcome of certain battles, where typically they exaggerate the Chinese casualties and underrepresent the British ones. This did not simply mean lowering the numbers of casualties. Often the British casualties are always somehow derived from accidents that the British did themselves. It's almost never anything the Chinese did during the battle. So to take this quote for example, even so, most of the casualties suffered by the attackers were caused not by Chinese force of arms, but by a gunpowder cache in one of the Daegu forts that accidentally exploded as the foreigners passed by. The Chinese lost 100 men. This paragraph is almost certainly false. The Daegu fort's battle in question was one of the very few successes the Chinese had during these wars, and it was very well reported on. Do not take this evidence to not read the book, however. Like most works of history, you should simply take the sources with a grain of salt and do your own due diligence, and cross-reference events with other sources, such as Chinese sources, which are hard to come by, mind you, on this. I have a few more quotes I'd like to read just to kind of reiterate what I'm getting at. So here's another one. The regular Chinese army suffered 500 casualties in the attack on Ningbo. Amazingly, the British escaped unscathed. Another one. 3 British brigades landed outside the city walls in the early hours of July 21st, 1842, a day so humid and hot that 20 British soldiers died from dehydration, the only casualties the attackers sustained. As you can see, they're talking about another 2 battles that were going on during these Opium Wars. It's ludicrous to say that the British suffered no casualties when in fact they were scaling some walls in this battle in question, and simply to sum up that, oh, some men got dehydrated sick and that accounts for why 2 bodies were put in bags on the way home. Again, it's just British officers at the time were trying to over-exaggerate their achievements. They really wanted it to seem like, how could the British lose to such an inferior force against them? That would be in their words, mind you. The book goes into great detail on the economics behind the Opium Wars, and it makes for a fantastic representation of how trade issues lead to conflict. To summarize, the book explains how Britain became economically and literally addicted to Chinese tea during the 17th and 19th century. China only accepted payments in the form of silver. Britain eventually ran into a silver trade deficit with China, and on top of this, the American Revolution and other wars that were going on led to an enormous war debt, and soon Britain ran completely out of silver. Without any silver to pay for its tea, how was Britain going to get its tea fix? There was a fine equilibrium going on at this time. Britain was illicitly trading opium from its new colony in India, and China was basically taking this on the chin because it wasn't doing too much damage even though it was an illicit trade, so they were turning a blind eye. This is all fine and dandy until the equilibrium was broke. You see, we had an industrial revolution occur. The steam engine was created. When the steam engine was created, Britain massively started to produce textiles, especially in northern England. With all these textiles, the market flooded. Where was Britain going to sell all of its textiles? India. So, when Britain began to sell to India, all the Indians who were cultivating opium at the time said, okay, we need to cultivate more opium to be able to buy your textiles. Britain ends up with a ton more opium. Britain gives the opium more and more to China. Then the trade deficit goes crazy for China. China is losing all of its silver deposits and China freaks out. And that's a pretty good summary of why the Opium Wars began. So, to kind of go a bit more into this, to add a little bit more spice, Frank Sanello kind of makes it more compelling by making the narrative more of a story. So you kind of notice with the way the chapters, and I'll kind of list them over here, how he names all the chapters gives it a little bit more flavor. It's more of you're reading these stories from eyewitness accounts and primary sources, and it's very well done because it's a very difficult time period to mash up because it's starting at the 17th century with some diplomatic ventures into China, but then most of the book is on the 19th century, and very specifically, the 1830 period. to 1842. That's like where a lot of it is condensed. Now, it should be noted that this isn't a military history book. Though, of course, it covers many battles, it does not delve as deeply as it could into battle strategies, tactics, and such. Instead, it gives you a typical history lesson. It's the only way to describe it. It's not your average textbook history lesson. It's more of a narrative, kind of as if you were telling a story. But it does give you that feeling of a textbook style. Now, excuse me. If you were looking for a military history perspective, I could make a recommendation. Osprey Publishing, Men at Arms series, makes quite a lot of books that are not as in-depth into certain events and things, but when it comes to the military aspect, the technology, what weapons were they using, what clothing were they using, who was using what were the factions, particularly in this case, the Chinese military structure of the Qing Dynasty is extremely complicated, and I really did like Osprey's way of showing the hierarchy in the military and the different groups. Also, Osprey has pictures. Interestingly enough, they're very good because you get more of a feeling of how these people looked because they had such fantastic uniforms, or no uniforms at all if you're dealing with someone like the Taiping rebels who wore a mishmash of weird colors. I can't say enough. There's 2 books in question. So, as I was saying, Osprey Publishing Men at Arms series. There's Imperial Chinese Armies 1840 to 1911, which covers this pretty specifically, and then there's also the Taiping Rebellion 1851 to 1866. Now this isn't it's somewhat related to the Opium Wars. It's currently happening during the Second Opium War, so a lot of the military side of this book on the, let's say, the Qing Dynasty military will be the exact same thing the British would have fought in the Opium Wars, so that's why I would recommend it. So again, actually, I'm going to delve into something else here. If you are a university student taking an Asian history course touching the 19th century, or perhaps you're looking at the history of narcotic trade, this book does an excellent job of summarizing these 3 key points. What political economic factors caused the 2 Opium Wars? What main factors led to the outcome of the 2 wars? And what was the significance of the 2 Opium Wars for the history of Asia and global history? I would highly recommend this book to university students because it is 289 pages long. And for us history students, that's a quick read. And I really enjoyed that because boy oh boy, I have a lot of books that are hitting that 1,000-page mark. And it would be worth your while to write a thesis explaining the issues with primary sources used in this book. Hint, hint, if you're going to write a thesis right now, undergrads. If you are Chinese or had an education in China, I would argue this book is not going to be too favorable, I do admit it does not do an adequate job in its portrayal of certain people. I have to say right off the bat, Lin Zexu, I hope I said that right, and excuse me, he's a notable hero of China, and he doesn't get an amazing portrayal in this book. It's not as if they're trying to besmirch his character. It's just maybe deserved a bit more respect, I found. This book does not sugarcoat anything, however. It really delves deep into the most shameful aspects of empire, particularly British, and it completely discloses a lot of what was going on in Parliament at the time, and I found that particularly interesting. And I think for a Chinese audience, you would be very interested in seeing how the British Parliament came to the conclusions and why they did some things the way they did, because it really shows you how impersonal it was. These Whig figures in Britain, they were just seeing dollar bill signs, and that's why they made a lot of these disgusting acts, quite honestly. For the general public, I would recommend this book if you are interested in the history of Asia and what led to the development of China as we see it today, the history of narcotic use, and the history behind drug cartels and how they were formed, because honestly, this book really is a blueprint into how most drug cartels today came to be. This was one of the first big drug scandals of all time. Probably the biggest, mind you. It's a fascinating look at 2 military powers clashing for the very first time. It's also a look at the evolution of warfare. This book often describes the battles in it as 17th century versus 19th century, a battle of medieval versus industrial. This is because there was a huge disparity, and the Chinese technology and arms they were using, they were quite outdated, hilariously outdated in some circumstances. I'm just going to say this off the bat. Most of the cannons the Chinese were using were old 17th century, welded to the ground, so they could basically just pivot a little bit. Almost every account of these cannons in forts shooting at the British, the cannonballs go right over their masts because they could not aim properly. So the British just peel in and just pelt these forts with almost nothing coming back at them. Which is another reason the British get away with over-exaggerating, because there is some truth to it. So, you know, when you win these fantastic battles and it's kind of a joke, makes it easy to lie about other things. As I already mentioned, if you're looking for a more military perspective, you should probably go see Ospreys, the two books I had mentioned earlier. You can also try, I'll think of recommendations for other books. You can try The Opium War by Julia Lovell, which looks more specifically at the myth-busting part of the Opium Wars. There's a lot of myths about them, mind you. She goes into great detail about the more shameful nature behind the ordeal and how the event significantly influences Chinese policies to this day. There is also Imperial Twilight, The Opium War and the End of China's Last Golden Age by Stephen R. Platt. This book is quite similar to The Opium Wars by Frank Sanello and Travis Haynes. It has a captivating narrative, more of a storytelling kind feeling to it, perhaps a little bit more dramatized to be honest, but it's a very good read. Note, it's 592 pages long, so you're going to get a lot more fluff than you did in this book, for instance. I really hope you enjoyed this summarized book review. I'm still testing the waters on how this is really going to go, and at the point I'm doing this episode for you, I'm probably about 30 books deep into my reading on the Pacific War. As you can see, I only have a few books here. Honestly, most of them are e-format, and for those of you who do, you know, papers and writing, it's so much easier. I know, I would love to have hard copies of every book, but it's honestly, it's so much easier, especially with keyword finding, because if you're cross-referencing 10 books, the amount of time to just scroll through the pages when you have a PDF file that you can just Control F, find whoever's name, find 10 accounts about them, it's really much easier to write. I really could love critique on how I did this. I think it's quite poor, to be honest. I hope you found it entertaining. I plan on doing book reviews, but as I said at the beginning, also Pacific War movie reviews. That's specifically in response to the Chinese film industry, because as soon as I start to do episodes, which are going to come out after this episode, mind you, I noticed China makes a lot of interesting World War II films in particular. Not to knock on China, they're good. They're honestly, a lot of them are better than Hollywood films, but boy, little bit of some exaggerations and some odd choice of narratives put in them, mind you. And I think it would be good for critique, especially as a Westerner watching them. Other than that, just to explain how this is going to work as far as the channel's going, I think I've only said this in one other episode. I hope and think my channel will follow this structure. It'll go in a 3-week structure. So there'll be an episode on an event, let's say the first Opium War. The next week will be followed by a book review on a book I probably used for that episode. That would make sense. And then the third week, I'm hoping to have a podcast with some of my fellow friends from university mostly. So it'll follow that 3-week structure, so I can kind of stretch these out, because the episodes themselves, the real ones, are taking a lot longer than I suspected, and I need to kind of produce a little bit more, let's just say. Anyways, this has been the Pacific War channel. I hope to see you soon, and please leave a like and subscribe. Over and out.